Okay, welcome everybody to the Education Writers Association's webinar on analyzing college finances. I'm Kim Clark, an Assistant Director of the EWA, and before we begin, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping arrangements. If you have questions for our speakers, type them into the question box that you see on your control panel. It should be on your right. If you can include your name and affiliation, that would be great. Please, you can ask your question at any time and we'll save them for the end, and I'll come back on and hopefully my technology will be better. As soon as the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. It takes like 2 seconds, literally, 15 seconds. And your feedback is really important and it helps us improve what we do. Today we're joined by analysts from Moody's Investor Service, which is a company that evaluates the ability of organizations to pay back their bonds. The team you'll be hearing from today spends all day, every day, analyzing college finances, higher education finances. And they're going to walk you through how they do it and what free resources are available to reporters who want to figure out the impact of the coronavirus on the colleges that they cover. That's a super important story right now, and it's really great that they're making time for us. Speaking of important stories, EWA has just announced the finalists to our National Awards for Education Reporting. Those just went live at 2. So after this is over, I hope you'll click over and see if you made the finalists or if your friends made the finalists. So now I'm going to turn this over to Danielle Douglas-Gabriel, who is a veteran education reporter for the Washington Post. And she's done a lot of terrific work looking at college finances. So take it away, Danielle.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you guys for joining us today. I think we have a really exciting panel ahead of us. You know, the pandemic has increased costs and decreased revenue throughout higher education. Colleges and universities of all types are bracing for budget cuts, layoffs, lower enrollment, and contending with the erosion of their endowments. Some schools are better positioned than others to ride this out, although that's subject to change depending on the duration and severity of the pandemic. The health crisis is already driving some schools out of business and leaving others on the brink of closure. We're hoping today's panel will give you a sense of how to figure out which schools are most at risk. Joining us today are Susan Fitzgerald, Associate Managing Director in the Global Higher Education and Not-for-Profit Ratings team at Moody's, Michael Osborne, Vice President and Senior Analyst on the Higher Education and Not-for-Profit Ratings team at Moody's, and David Jacobson, who has been very useful in my career, who is Vice President of Communications at Public Finance Group at Moody's Investor Services. We're going to start off with Susan, who's going to kind of give you guys the lay of the land. Susan?
Thank you very much. And if you want to share my screen here, can everyone see that? Perfect. So, the agenda today is that I'm going to give you a quick overview of Moody's and what we do. I think we've had already a couple of framing comments, give you a sense of the type of credit opinions that we publish. David will then talk about how you can access our information, and then Mike will go into some of the more detail around financial statement analysis. So Moody's is a major corporation. We do day in and day out analyze debt. You can see we rate over $70 trillion of debt across a broad variety of sectors. And I think it's really important to frame up that when we rate a debt issuance, we're really looking at that issuer's ability and willingness to repay that debt over the time frame that the debt is issued. So that's typically a 30-year time frame. In our analysis, therefore, we have to take a very long view about the financial health of the higher education sector itself, as well as the financial health of an individual institution and how it's placed in that sector. So our analysis really starts with a broad macro view of demand for higher education, the macroeconomic environment, competition globally, and then we really drill down into each individual's financial health. You'll see on here that we publish a lot of research. Our research is therefore on both individual specific names of debt borrowers, as well as on a broad variety of industry trends. Our ratings cover nearly 500 public and private colleges and universities in the US. For public colleges, we rate about 90% of enrollment. So that is because places like California State University, SUNY, University of Texas, which are large public university systems, issue as a single entity and therefore only count as one in this. We rate about 260 private colleges and universities. That's a smaller share of the number of colleges and universities, and that's in large part because there are a significant number of really very small private colleges and universities that may not have significant endowment levels or reserves and have not accessed the public capital markets on their own credit quality. This table that you see on slide 5, I think, provides an interesting perspective on the sector, because you'll see our ratings range from AAA, which is the highest rating. Think of that as like a Harvard, a Yale, a Stanford, all the way down to the C category rating, which is right now the lowest rating, and that is for the University of Puerto Rico. The break between what we call investment grade and sub-investment grade is here at the Baa3 level. So something that's rated Baa3 really or higher really means that we think it's highly unlikely that they are not going to be able to repay their debt, typically over a 30-year time frame. And I think what's really striking about this chart, when you look at it relative to some of the discussion around the strength of the higher education sector, is that it points out how resilient the sector really is. Most of the ratings are in the AA and or the A, AA, and AAA range, so very highly rated. Many of these universities have strong brands, strong reserves, and have really proven themselves to be resilient and durable during various economic cycles. So among our rated portfolio, despite some of the challenges that the sector is facing right now, we're not anticipating that for most of these, that coronavirus is going to pose a really existential risk to their ability to continue to serve students over time. Having said that, we did recently change our higher education outlook to negative. We did that in March of this year, and our outlooks for the sector really are based on what we view as the business conditions that colleges are going to face over an 18-month time frame. So as we looked out from March out for another 18 months, we were seeing business conditions, as Danielle highlighted, where colleges and universities for the current fiscal year, which goes through June 30th in most cases, really having some expense increases, lost revenue that they would really have to adjust to. We're seeing them adjust to that. If you think about all of the news that's come out in terms of layoffs, furloughs, cuts in pay, those are all reactions that colleges and universities are taking to maintain their financial stability in the face of the very difficult business conditions that they are confronting. As we look out to fiscal year 2021, which really starts again July 1st and goes through academic year 2020 to 2021, we see that there's just a lot more uncertainty and risk on the horizon. Uncertainty around enrollment and what that might look like next year, both for domestic and international students. For public universities, significant uncertainty around state funding, uncertainty around what philanthropy might look like given financial market volatility, as well as what could potentially happen to asset values. So our our outlook incorporates that uncertainty. I think let's move down to the next page. Hold on, it's stalling. So having said that, that's kind of the macro environment in which we are operating. As we look at individual credits, we then look at them within the context of our methodology, which, if we look on the right side of this, lays out the key elements that we examine. So I would say we typically start with a college or university's market position, wide variety of different business models across the sector. So we look at their ability to attract and retain students, donors, research grants and contracts, philanthropy, all of that goes into a market profile. Size matters, that's what scope of operations are. Larger institutions tend to be a lot more resilient than smaller ones. And the market profile really then drives these other components, which are operating performance and an institution's ability to balance its budget every year, the level of wealth it has, and we look at various levels of wealth. And it also drives their capital program and the amount of debt that they have to take on. So all of those are elements that we look at as we do our credit analysis. Our methodology includes other credit considerations. I think at this point in time, one of the most important is multi-year trends. So as we look at the financial health of colleges and universities, we're taking a measured approach to that. It really is trying to look through the current cycle, and the challenge is obviously we don't know how long the cycle is. That's why governance and management are critically important to our rating assessments. Their management's ability to adapt to changing business considerations. Liquidity right now is core to our analysis, the ability to rely on reserves as colleges are looking at operational volatility, any risks that might come from debt structure, the government relationship, and this for public universities is with the state government, but for all universities also has to do with the relationship of the federal government, which, as we know, has provided some relief, partial relief through the CARES Act, but is also a major funder for the sector through various financial aid, student loan programs, research, et cetera. So that becomes a core element of our analysis. And then for those that have healthcare operations, obviously those have a specific exposure right now to what's the health impact of the coronavirus. So as we look at individual credits, as I said, we do publish credit opinions on each one. We've put in a couple of examples here really that are just illustrative, and I'm not planning on going through the credit profiles of these institutions in depth. Our credit opinions include a summary credit opinion. It talks about the individual strengths and challenges we see, gives a sense of the outlook that we have for the rating for that particular issuer, what could change the rating either up or down, and then goes into a lot of detail around their market profile, their operating profile, wealth and liquidity, leverage. So it gives you a very in-depth view of the credit factors that drive our view of financial health. Here is an example for Gonzaga University. That's one of the last upgrades we did for the sector. Back in September of last year, we upgraded the rating to A2 from A3. Really driven by, you can see on here in very tiny type, some robust gift support and some capital investment that they had been doing that we thought was really going to position them well over the longer term in terms of their competitive position. Each of our credit opinions also includes a data table that supports the analysis. So for Gonzaga, for example, I might point out the growth of cash and investments over time, the consistency of revenue growth, and the strength of their operating cash flow. Central Michigan is a university that we recently downgraded. It was downgraded to A1 with a stable outlook from AA3. An A1 rating, as a reminder, is still a very solid and strong rating, but some of the pressures that they were seeing are illustrated in this front page chart: declining enrollment and declining growth in net tuition revenue. Here is their data table. Again, you can see some of those trends manifesting themselves here. With that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Susan. I'm only going to talk for a couple of minutes here, but the reason I am on the call is that if you want to reach anyone at Moody's in the future for any sort of story you may be writing or any questions you might have, you're probably going to contact me first. And we do this basically to make things easy for you. You only have to contact and remember the name of one person, who is me. We have a very large squad of higher ed analysts, and you don't want to keep track of this analyst has this at college, this analyst has this college. We can work this out for you. So why you would contact me, I have here. The first question you probably have is, hey, I'm following this particular university. Do you rate it? The good news is that's something you don't even need me for. You can go on to moodys.com, which is our website. There's a quick free registration, which I promise does not take long. And we allow anyone to at least look up the ratings for any of those colleges. So if we rate it, it will be there in our database. And you can also access some, not all of the information Susan just showed you, but some of the information there. You get sort of like an executive summary. Now, what you can contact me for is everything that is further listed under the second bullet. So if you want a full report of University X, we can get it for you. If you want some higher ed research, we've been doing a lot of this lately in terms of the coronavirus. Susan recently said we changed the outlook of higher education from stable to negative. If you want that, that's something that I'm happy to put you to get for you. If you have a basic question where we don't need to bother an analyst, for example, you saw the rating scale earlier. If you're like, well, what is the difference between an A1 versus a double A1? That's something I can help you out with on background. If you need to speak to a higher ed analyst, something where I can't help you or some larger story you're doing, that's something that I can arrange. And then if you want to be added to our higher ed media distribution lists, you can contact me for that. My contact information is on the next slide, which you can go at now. There we go. There's my contact information at the bottom. One other thing we do have a public finance Twitter feed where we send out snippets of information, research, and credit opinions on higher education. For example, when we had those changes on Gonzaga and Central Michigan, we just sent out some of those graphics with that. Now, this is for public finance, not just higher education. However, we're included in public finance for a few reasons because, especially for public universities, what states are going to be doing with their budgets, that's going to have an impact on higher education. So you get additional information on that you may find valuable. That's all I have to say. You may contact me whenever you want, and we'll turn it over to Mike now.
Okay, thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, I guess, depending on where you're located. Here we're going to take a look at a few snapshots from various financial statements. If you have limited time or limited experience with financial statements, I just want to leave you with a few nuggets or just a few go-tos, if you will, to help you glean some useful information when you pick up a financial statement. It's important to understand which revenue streams drive operating performance. For most colleges and universities, tuition revenue will be the most significant revenue stream. However, for some large comprehensive universities, it might be patient care revenue if they happen to operate a health system. And for some wealthy liberal arts colleges, it might be investment income. The financial statements will tell you this, but if you know in advance, it might help you focus your attention if you're operating under time constraints or just looking for a few key pieces of information. The next slide, please. The balance sheet appears first in the financial statements. It's going to tell you how much they own, assets, and how much they owe, liabilities. At first glance, I'm looking at how much cash and investments the university retains, and I'm contrasting that with how much debt they owe. The balance sheet will also tell us if there is any pension exposure here and how large that exposure is. Additionally, if they use interest rate swaps as part of their debt structure, we'll see any liability associated with it here, which could be a possible use of cash. The income statement will follow the balance sheet and the financial statements. It's going to show us sources of revenue and therefore the scope of a university's operations. We'll get a sense of how large the university is. Revenue diversification is important, insulating university operations from a shock in any one business line. So we're certainly looking at the diversification of revenue. We'll want to look at trends in revenue and expenses over multiple years. Is expense growth outpacing revenue growth? Is revenue declining? These are some of the questions we'll want to answer at first glance. And so in the next slide, we're going to begin, keeping with our already cited example. We'll take a quick look at some key data points from Gonzaga University's financial statements. There are some reporting differences between private and public universities. Private universities like Gonzaga publish financial statements under FASB standards, which is the Financial Accounting Standards Board. These standards are also used by public university foundations and other not-for-profits, such as cultural organizations, service and advocacy organizations, and research institutes, for example. Also, not-for-profit health systems would use FASB reporting. And so here we're looking at assets on the balance sheet. If I had a limited amount of time and I wanted to seek out some key data points, I would be immediately drawn to cash and investment-related line items, and those are highlighted here. And then, of course, trends in those assets over time. I'm also taking a quick look at what's called contributions receivable, and there's a little sort of a highlight dot next to that, especially for a university that relies on fundraising. And Gonzaga would be, I would say, maybe an intermediate, in terms of how much they rely on fundraising. But it's a good leading indicator of future cash in the door from philanthropic activities. And so then after assets, we get to liabilities in the balance sheet. And I'm immediately drawn to debt. And so I'm looking at notes and bonds payable. And if I have more time, I'm measuring that debt against the cash and investments we just looked at to get a sense of how healthy this balance sheet is. And again, if I have a limited time, I'm taking a quick look at deferred revenue, which has a little highlight dot next to it. And evaluated over time, this could give you a good sense of what they're collecting, or how well they're collecting tuition payments from students, and can be an indicator of enrollment stress if this number is in decline. And so then the conclusion of the balance sheet will be net assets. And this is a very important part of the balance sheet. And I'm drawn to two things here. And one of them that maybe you'd want to highlight is what's here is listed as perpetuity. So I'm looking at how much of their assets are unrestricted, and that's under the highlighted category without donor restrictions, meaning these assets can be used by the university. There are no time or purpose restrictions on these assets. And then secondly, I'm looking at how much of these assets are restricted or highlighted, you'll see, with donor restrictions. In particular, I'm looking at those assets that are restricted in perpetuity, meaning the university can't touch these assets at all. And so taken together, these items will give us a sense of how much operational flexibility the university might have, how much cash they can use in a pinch. And so then following the balance sheet, I'm getting to you'll take a look at the income statement. And I'm drawn to a few key lines right away. I'm looking at tuition revenue after scholarships, or what's commonly cited as net tuition revenue. I'm looking at contributions or gift revenue. And then I'm also looking at then total operating revenue. Is that revenue rising or is it declining? And then below revenue, we get to expenses. And here I'm immediately drawn to what they list as salaries, wages, and benefits, or just compensation. Because for most universities, this will consume about 2/3 of their budget. And some have a lot of flexibility in this area, and some have very limited flexibility in this area. And so similar to revenue, I want to know what the total expense bucket is here. And I want to know how those expenses stack up to revenue. And I want to know that over time. I want to know if expenses are outpacing revenues, if they're tightly aligned, how much profit is there? Are they running deficits? And so this will all be important information. So again, keeping with our already cited example, we'll take a quick look at Central Michigan University and just a key financial reporting distinction on the income statement that I want to focus on. By and large, you can ascertain the same information, just like we looked at Gonzaga from Central Michigan's financial statements. But a quick nuance here, public universities issue under a separate set of standards, and the income state of public universities report income as either operating income or non-operating income. And while private universities include it all under one bucket. And non-operating revenues will include items like state appropriations, which are highlighted here, student financial aid, like federal Pell Grants, and fundraising. So these are obviously key components of a university's budget. So we'll want to make sure we look at this extra section, this income section, which will be listed below expenses in a GASB financial statement. And here at the bottom, highlighted, is where we'll see how profitable they are or unprofitable the university was. And this is an interesting example because leading up to the downgrade that Susan cited, you'll see that in fiscal year 19, they actually reported a deficit of about $12.5 million. Prior to that, they reported a profit of about $13 million. And so after you look at the financial statements, if you have more time and you want to really get into the details, the footnotes are very important. And they'll give you a lot of really good details about the university's financial position. And here you can learn more about the organizational structure, how they're governed, how they're managed. You can drill down into the investments the university makes with its cash and determine how liquid those investments are, how accessible they are. And also how much they use each year to support operations, which is commonly known as the endowment spend or endowment draw. You can find out more about the university's debt structure and potential covenants associated with their debt. And a covenant can restrict a university's flexibility in terms of how much debt it can issue. It can also hold the university to certain financial covenants. That it could hold the university to certain financial restraints. As long as it holds particular debt. And so violation of these covenants is critical. It's very important to monitor these covenants. And a violation of the covenant could mean that the university has to repay their debt all at once and in full. I mean, that would be an extreme situation, which would be a huge draw on universities' cash and investments. And so I just want to leave you then on with the footnotes here, just two interesting examples where, without reading the footnotes, you wouldn't know this if you just simply looked at the financial statements. And here we look at Bard College, and in their note 6, they note that they were in violation of a particular financial covenant. And we get more information on how the bank is treating that covenant. And here they were still in the process of figuring out whether or not they would have to repay the bank for violation of this covenant. And additionally here, and I think really important for Bard, is you see that they're actually borrowing money from their endowment. And so this is something you might not glean from just looking at the financial statements, where you have this sort of institutional borrowing, if you will. And so this is, it's sort of a risky move and very important to note. Next is Zusa Pacific University, again, another university that was in violation of a covenant. And so here we find out that they, in their forbearance agreement, after they violated that covenant, they had, at least at that point, met the requirements of forbearance. And so, very important to look at the footnotes, again, if you have time. And so where do you access all this information? If you have, and most of these sources that I'll leave you with are, I believe they're all free. And so if you're looking for some very good demographic information or enrollment resources, we use these a lot. You could check out the Department of Education with their college scorecard. Of course, then you have National Center for Educational Statistics, which is just a great database of prior enrollment, projected enrollment, population characteristics, economic characteristics, and so on. But just a great, just vast amounts of data. And then WICHE, Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, a great resource. They do a lot of work on projecting the number of high school graduates across the country, broken out by regions and even by state. But great for trying to project future enrollment and looking at pockets of stress. And then on the financial statement side and disclosure side, resource that we use all the time is EMMA, or Electronic Municipal Market Access, and it's a free resource. And universities that issue debt in the public capital markets, this is a sort of an aggregator of disclosure that they have to comply with. And so here you'll find financial statements and those covenants I talked about. Here they'll post on EMMA if they were in violation of a particular covenant. Here you can view if a particular rating agency upgraded or downgraded or revised the outlook of a particular university. So you can find all sorts of great information here. ProPublica, which is a great tool to access 990s. And 990s, if you're not familiar with them, they're massive documents, and it's like a financial statement on steroids, because in addition to the information I just talked about, you'll get some great information on governance. Typically they'll list key donors or benefactors of the organization. You'll see how much senior executives make, their salaries and benefits and so on. So a nice drill down into the finances of a university. And then Grapevine is a nice aggregator of state funding data. And so they do a really nice job of putting all the state budgets in one area, allowing us to sort of observe and monitor what state governments are doing. And so I think with that, I'll pause. I think that concludes our presentation, or at least our formal remarks.
Okay. All right. So guys, actually, I'm going to start off with a couple of questions just to kind of get the ball rolling, and then we will take some questions from the audience. And this is directed to whoever wants to respond. But I wonder, are there any specific regions of the country where you anticipate colleges will endure the most financial distress?
Sure. Why don't I start, Mike, and then you can kind of chime in. I think we've highlighted that colleges in the Northeast and Midwest are particularly challenged by some of the demographic trends. That's really where we've seen more pressure on enrollment and more pressure on ability to grow net tuition revenue. And that would contrast with many of the states in the West and the South, which have had more positive enrollment trends and greater pricing flexibility because of the increasing demand. Mike, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I would agree. Just with regard to demographics, in the Midwest, we start to see, a lot of these public universities, for example, are offering, and this is more widespread throughout the country now, but this sort of tuition price reciprocity and a grab to recruit out-of-state students. So rather than charging out-of-state rates, you're seeing them charge in-state rates to try to lure out-of-state students. And so it's just a very highly competitive market, and like Susan said, the inability to grow that tuition revenue is difficult.
And I think we'll see more of that as we look out to fall of this year and most likely even fall of 2021, given some of the disruption around coronavirus, just an extremely competitive environment. I'm sure most of the folks on this phone follow trends in tuition discounting and pricing strategies, and those are key elements that we look at as well. But I think it's important to note that this whole concept around tuition discounting is no longer just for domestic students. We're seeing it apply to graduate students, international students, and as Mike said, public universities are now pursuing very sophisticated pricing and discounting strategies akin to what their public or private university peers have done.
Are there certain types of schools that are in the greatest danger of not making it through this economic crisis? And by type, I mean small liberal arts versus regional publics.
Well, I think the type of school that immediately comes to mind for me would be the small private college, and it wouldn't be that wealthy liberal arts college I mentioned in the prepared remarks, but it might be the school that's less resourced. It's this in the outlook piece. If you picked it up, you might notice that we call out schools that would be most stressed, and we reference publics as well, but it would be those schools that are currently who entered this outbreak or this crisis, if you will, with operating stress, and maybe they were generating operating deficits, they were losing money, and these schools had limited financial resources, and so combined, that makes for a very difficult situation. Now, this is our rated universe, and so these schools may have other resources to tap. But if you then take this beyond our rated universe and think about the other 4,000 schools that are out there, they may not be well resourced, may not have other means to tap, if you will, to get through this difficult time. I think those schools, and those will primarily be the smaller private schools, and those are certainly under the most stress.
Mm-hmm. Although I would say, Mike, I think we've found that it's really hard to predict which is the next college to close. Even some of these small private colleges have been resilient through cycles. They tend to have a lot of constituents that are supporting them. You may have one or more donors who kind of step in at the last moment. Some of these colleges may be the largest employer in their town, even though they're small. And so oftentimes you'll see some state intervention or other interested parties who kind of step up to the plate. So unlike a lot of just traditional kind of corporate entities, the rationality around private college finances can be hard to determine because of all of those interested parties.
I noticed from the outlook, there was a lot of attention paid to public universities because they're kind of a different beast here because they have to rely on state appropriations as well as all of the other revenue streams that their peers do in the private sector. So I wonder how financially prepared are public colleges and universities to weather this financial crisis, and how does that compare to their fiscal health going into the Great Recession?
Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting. We have historically not seen any public universities default on their debt. They tend to have implicit support from the state. The state does not typically guarantee their debt, but when a public college gets into financial difficulty, the state will typically find some way of supporting them. It could be a temporary form of liquidity support. It could be replacement of management or governance, or it could be merging them into a larger, healthier system. So that's a very different profile than private colleges and universities, which have a greater potential risk of closing. I will say that if you went back 10 years ago, we didn't have any public universities rated in the speculative grade range. But what we have seen is that public universities are typically the largest component of most state budgets. And as states are looking to balance their own books, they typically pass on oftentimes significant budget cuts to the public university sector. And we have seen some public universities endure some pretty significant financial stress where they've had to make some extraordinarily difficult budget decisions. And it can be harder for them to do that in some cases as public entities, and again, as large public employers, and often with unionized faculty and staff, and not quite as much independent control over their operations. Mike, would you add anything to that?
Well, no, I didn't read. I haven't read into the details yet, but Susan, maybe you have. But just this morning we saw that the state of North Carolina is actually, and I don't know in what form, but actually helping their public universities, and it sounds like maybe even some private universities. And so there you have a state that's stepping in and doing more. And maybe you contrast that with, I'm thinking of one that comes to mind is the state of Nevada. And the university system there was forced to make a cut to augment some state appropriation reductions, and they're looking at doing the same thing in the next fiscal year. So just a different set of circumstances for different states.
Yeah, it is very state specific, and even state regulations differ widely from state to state. In some states, public universities are allowed to kind of retain surplus funds and build up reserves over time. In other states, they have much more limited ability to do that. So it becomes a state and university specific analysis.
You know, so much of this is happening in real time for a lot of schools in terms of announcing layoffs and pay cuts and furloughs and the potential of these things looming in the future. I wonder, how should we as reporters view austerity measures that are announced by schools? Is there a certain level of pay cuts or layoffs that should start to raise alarms, especially now when every school, just about from your Harvards down to your local community college, is announcing these sorts of measures?
Yeah. Mike, why don't I start and then you can kind of chime in. So I would say that from a credit perspective, from looking at the long-term financial viability of colleges and universities, these schools are doing what they need to do in order to preserve their financial health. So it's actually been in some ways surprising to me how quickly some of the schools have reacted, and surprising in a very positive way. Because some of the decisions they're making are very difficult decisions to make. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about, governance and management. I think some schools are in a better position to do these cuts in a very strategic way because they've done contingency planning, they've done scenario planning, they knew what would happen in a downturn. Others might not be as prepared and might be taking more of kind of an across the board approach to it rather than a targeted approach. So from our perspective, it's understanding kind of order of magnitude and how they're approaching the cuts and furloughs that becomes important as part of the analysis. I would say that, again, here's where scale matters. So the larger the institution, the more ability they have to do some of these cuts without impairing their core competitiveness. One of the challenges that the small colleges face that Mike highlighted is that they have a business model that is very expensive. They have small classes, a very personal touch. And once they start making those kinds of layoffs, one of the risks they face is that it could impair their brand, or it could influence students around enrollment. But in terms of kind of an immediate reaction to a severe revenue hit, many of those steps are necessary steps to maintain financial viability. Mike, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just say that from a credit perspective, it is positive that they are addressing these fiscal issues and making these expense reductions where appropriate. I'm drawn. I think about the school that has been under stress for some time already and have been making cuts for years, and then now here comes the situation, and then it sort of begs the question: is there room to make more cuts? And so, like Susan said, without impacting brand or mission, and can they do that without impacting the student experience? And so that's where it will get difficult, I think, for some schools. And then again, offsetting that would be the school or the university that like Susan said, has scale, has room to do that without harming mission. That's critically important here.
Okay, guys, we're going to open it up to audience questions, and let's give us a second here. And please feel free to submit questions whenever you are ready for the folks who are joining us. Okay, have one here. What ratios on tuition revenue as a percentage of total operations would be concerning for both private nonprofit and public universities?
So I think it becomes a question of how strong their brand is and their ability to grow that net tuition revenue. So we see some universities that have a 70 to 80% reliance on tuition revenue. That's high. We even have some that are in the 90% range. But let's say you have a 70 to 80% reliance on tuition revenue, but you have extraordinarily strong and steady demand. And the ability to grow net tuition per student, that's a very different profile than a college or university that's 70 or 80% reliant on tuition revenue, that's having enrollment volatility and challenges. and where discounting is increasing.
All right. So our next question, can you, either of you, address where people can find forward-looking indicators? Because some of the data tends to be a little bit older, which can be a little challenging when everything is happening immediately and in real time.
Mike, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Nowhere. So, I don't know, but seriously, there is a lag of real data in higher education, and Susan mentioned earlier that most universities operate on a June 30 budget, and so we might not see the financial statements until October, and for some even later than that, and so. And same thing with enrollment information. Students who enroll in the fall, you may not really know until they publish the head count in October or whenever that is. But there is a real lag, and so I think that's where the trend is very important. So as we look over the course of time, is it is it realistic to think that a university that has been performing this way is likely to just all of a sudden shift to another way? And so that's where the collective experience of our team comes in handy, because we've seen these cycles before. We've seen universities on their way up, on their way down, and so it's what's important to sort of use our what we've observed and try to project ahead. But one of the benefits we have is that we do have conversations with management often, and we're able to get some of that forward-looking information that we can then inject in our analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say for public universities, oftentimes they will publish budget books on their websites. They may be doing reporting to their independent state agencies, but for private colleges and universities, it's very hard to get that information absent kind of really understanding the environment they're in, and doing some forecasting around just the demographics of that environment, and looking at some historical trend analysis to try and project forward. Absent having that access to the management team, it's very hard.
We have another question from the audience. Do you factor actions taken by accreditors into consideration when issuing your ratings? And how are you notified when an accreditor has taken a positive or negative action against one of your rated institutions?
So we do pay attention to what the accreditors are saying, because there could be obviously very significant financial ramifications for any school that were to actually lose its accreditation. We follow all of the actions as they're posted on the accreditors' websites. We don't have previews of what actions are going to be taken, so it's kind of real time, and then we engage in trying to assess the severity of the actions and the likelihood of various outcomes. So just because an institution is placed under probation or warning doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to result in a rating action. It really depends on our assessment of the risk around that and what's driving that.
Another question from our audience. What are some things reporters tend to get wrong or not quite right when they cover higher education finances, and how do they get it right? How do we fix our mistakes there?
Oh, goodness. I would say that much of the reporting actually around the sector is quite good. From our observation, there tends to be more focus on kind of downside rather than upside. And particularly now, a lot of the stories around the higher education sector are really focused on and maybe appropriately so, the institutions that are in trouble. We're more focused on risk to investors and bondholders. So many of the schools that are in trouble are very small schools. They have not a lot of enrollment. So as we think about the higher education sector itself, again, the sector is resilient, demand is resilient, individual small institutions may be under stress. And I think there's a danger of extrapolating what's happening with some of these small institutions to kind of broad-based observations around the sector as a whole. Like, I don't know if you'd have anything to add to that. I don't want to touch it.
I agree. Now we're entering a down cycle. So I get that. But, you know, we did upgrade quite a few schools over the last couple of years. And I can tell you it's the same thing that happens when we upgrade anybody else, whether it's a state or a city. You don't get the same attention that you do for a negative action, even though that's the case. And just echoing what Susan said, people sometimes see these small schools that are in trouble and they get the incorrect, feeling that this is what's happening to all of higher education, which is not the case.
It's important. Another question from our audience. Are you expecting enrollment growth like we saw in the recession?
So that's a really interesting question. We've done some analysis, and certainly if the correlation between unemployment and the economy held for this fall, we would expect to see some fairly significant enrollment growth. And we would expect to see community colleges in particular benefit from that. So what we saw with the last recession was growth in community colleges and a tilt of enrollment to schools with strong brand names or strong value propositions. It was kind of the middle of those that struggled a little bit more. But this isn't the last recession, right? Here we have a health crisis that's layered on top of that. And so the real question in part is consumer behavior. I don't know that we're expecting to see dramatic enrollment declines. Again, maybe some shifts of enrollment, maybe some deferrals of enrollment. But again, given the economy, it's not as if though these students would necessarily have well-paying jobs that the schools would be competing with. So really hard to predict because you have two countervailing forces. One is really significantly rising unemployment that would push individuals to attend college, but a health crisis on top of that.
So one of our members wanted to know, do institutions automatically get downgraded if they run a deficit?
Mike, why don't you take that one?
Oh yeah. No, they don't. They are not automatically downgraded. But that has to be taken into context. And I think here's where trends matter. And we'd want to look at how they operate over time and how deep is this deficit and what is we need the story. What is it related to? And are they using cash to augment maybe a shortfall in revenue? And so these are all, we have to run our own investigation to sort of find out why. But there are some universities that run deficits year in and year out. And they're very highly rated universities, and it's just has become part of their business model. And this might be a university that is that has a lot of wealth. And that's one unique aspect of higher education of our sector, at least our rated universities, is that these universities are by and large very wealthy, and they may have the ability or the flexibility to run a deficit and have the backstop of a very healthy balance sheet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to echo Mike's point, it's really a question of, is this sustained fundamental fiscal imbalance due to a weak market position so that we don't see it turning it around? Or is it really kind of a temporary situation where, and oftentimes they'll come to us and say, for the next 3 years, we're going to run an operating deficit because we're making investments in X, Y, and Z. And if they can clearly articulate why they're running the deficits and we can see the return that they're making from those investments, that's a very different perspective than an institution that's financially struggling because it can't attract students or donors.
This one's a little tough. I don't suspect, this is from one of our audience, I don't suspect that many institutions that were rated by Moody's have closed or merged, but if there were any, could changes in your ratings have predicted those future closures or mergers? Is it fair to use ratings for that purpose?
So you're right, we haven't had that many that were rated by us close. The most recent one was Dowling College. and it was rated deeply speculative grade at the time it closed, and it started to experience a series of downgrades well over a decade before that closure happened. So again, our ratings are intended to be measures of financial risk, and the further down in the speculative grade range a college falls, the higher the financial risk and potential for closure there could be. But again, our ratings are not meant to say this is a college that's going to close. It's meant to say this is a college that could potentially default on its debt. And there are slight nuances between the two. David, would you add anything to that?
I would say that one thing you want to look at, Mike talked about trends. If you go on our website, you should be able to see the trend of a college rating. We also have something called an outlook, which is attached to the rating, which kind of indicates the direction of a rating, whether it's, we can have a positive outlook, which means there's a chance it could be upgraded, a stable outlook, or a negative outlook, which means there's a slightly greater chance of a downgrade. If I remember correctly, Susan, I think Dowling was very deep in speculative grade territory for several years before it, I think it defaulted as well as going bankrupt and closing. And I believe when it happened, Dowling was the first higher education credit we had that had defaulted.
Yeah, so, but I think again, that was also an interesting case where if you were to look purely at financial metrics, you might have predicted closure or default even earlier, but they had a very dedicated, a particular very dedicated board member who provided significant philanthropy that kept it going longer than pure financial metrics might have suggested, which is again why it's so hard to predict college closures on any particular time frame.
Okay, well, this is great. We've already used an hour of your very valuable time. I want to thank our guests from Moody's, Michael, David, and Susan, and of course, Danielle, the wonderful Danielle. Thank you for taking an hour out of your day. I hope everybody found this helpful. I'd like to remind everybody, as soon as this is over, you're going to get a little tiny survey. It really is like 2 questions. Please fill it out to help us out, and check out our website and see if you or any of your friends made the finalists for the National Awards for Education Reporting. As you know, we're increasing the number of webinars that we're running, so we're doing about 2 a week. So if there's any other subjects you'd like to hear about or any experts you'd like to hear from, please email us and let us know what you'd be interested in. Thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.